Tonight we're pleased to welcome Andrew Diamond, Professor of American History and Civilization at the Sorbonne in Paris. He is the author or co-author of numerous articles and books on the history of race, politics, and political culture in the urban United States, including Mean Streets, Chicago's Youth and the Everyday Struggle for Empowerment in the Multiracial City, 1908 through 1969. Andrew joins us to discuss and read from his new book, titled Chicago on the Make, Power and Inequality in a Modern City, in which he traces the evolution of the city's politics, culture, and economy as it grew from an unruly tangle of rail yards, slaughterhouses, factories, tenement houses, and fiercely defended ethnic neighborhoods into a truly global urban center. One review of Andrew's new work states, "This is the indispensable history of the Windy City, a work of urban history at its best." We're very pleased he has returned to the Chicago Public Library. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Diamond.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here to hear this. I'm going to just talk to you a little bit first. I wrote out a sort of presentation of the book to talk a little bit about how the project evolved out of some of my earlier work, and then I'm going to read you part of the book. So at this point in my career, I've written about 800 pages covering roughly 115 years of Chicago's storied past. The two books originated under different circumstances, they take varied approaches, and they were written for somewhat different audiences. The first, Mean Streets, Chicago Youth and the Everyday Struggle for Empowerment in the Multiracial City, is a history from below, in the fullest sense of the term, that seeks to place working class youths at the center of a story of grassroots ethno-racial struggle and conflict that shaped Chicago's political culture from the 1900s to the 1970s. The main idea behind that project was to demonstrate that the interfaces between different ethno-racial groups within the city were dynamic sites for the development of political ideas and actions. Racial and ethnic identities, I argued, crystallized at the boundaries between communities in struggles with racial and ethnic others over turf, status, and resources, and these identities became vitally linked to political activities and projects, culminating in the great era of contentious politics beginning in the 1960s. While I showed that young people were principal actors along these interfaces, I also assert that their actions had important consequences for their broader communities. If, as British sociologist Paul Gilroy once observed, quote, collective identities spoken through race, community, and locality are, for all their spontaneity, powerful means to coordinate actions and create solidarity, unquote. Working class youths, Black, Puerto Rican, Mexican, and white youths alike, were particularly skilled at the art of transforming spatially defined notions of race and community into politically potent bonds of solidarity and forms of political action. Young actors, often organized into street gangs, were capable of bringing thousands into the streets in Chicago's working class districts in the 1950s and 1960s. And as a result, they played critical roles in pulling African American communities towards the politics of Black power, Puerto Ricans towards the politics of Boricua power, Mexicans towards the politics of La Raza, and white communities towards whiteness and a style of populist politics that historians have referred to as defensive localism for the way it involved protecting neighborhood, community, and family from the threat of racial integration. Now, I think it's fair to describe all of these movements in this great era of contentious politics as somehow identity-based, even if much more than the politics of race and recognition were at stake in them. In the case of African Americans, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans, these minority empowerment movements rallied average citizens to rise up against the injustices and inequalities maintained by Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley's autocratic rule, to demand civil and economic rights, political representation, better schools and social services, and, of course, improved relations with the police. But tragically, the bonds of solidarity and the sense of linked fate, and that's a term I borrow from Michael Dawson, they depended upon for their vitality also worked to divide the different communities arrayed against the dominant political and economic order. The subsequent lack of cooperation across racial and ethnic lines by the forces that were opposing the political establishment enabled Daley to garner vast majorities of the Black and Latino vote up until his last election in 1975. Indeed, as you probably know, he would never be voted out of office. He would leave in an ambulance after suffering a heart attack at his desk. In the final analysis, Mean Streets thus represented an attempt to explain from the bottom up how Daley could rule over a city of rampant corruption and savage inequalities without ever feeling the heat of a contested election. Steering away from the usual explanations of the carrot and the stick, I wanted to show how an ultimately divisive kind of identity politics emerged naturally out of everyday neighborhood life and became institutionalized in the 1960s, fracturing the ranks of those who shared an interest in opposing the status quo. The style of political engagement, I should point out, was during the 1960s being inscribed within the city's very geography, with the formation of ethno-racial enclaves in the areas of Pilsen and Humboldt Park, within a broader context of increasing black-white segregation. The book that brings me here to speak with you tonight, Chicago on the Make, builds on this previous work by weaving together this story from below with the story from above. My main objective in this project from the outset was to produce a crossover book that could interest a broad audience, and I hope it does, while managing to contribute a fresh perspective for scholars working on race, policy, and politics in the metropolitan United States. The book provides an extensive social, political, and economic history of the city from the turn of the 20th century to the Emanuel era that incorporates a great many of the excellent studies on Chicago that have been written over the past decades. This is a book that is intended to cover a lot of ground, so it can be of use to both students and specialists working not only in the history of Chicago, but also in the broader field of urban history. And that's my pitch. My publisher will be very happy I said that. However, it is also a book that possesses at its interpretive core what I think is a fresh analysis of Chicago's history. In particular, the narrative I develop seeks to historicize the conditions of resignation and political quiescence that prevailed in Chicago between the 1970s and the first decade of the 21st century, a period that saw the city's racial order hardening and its social inequalities widening. Having moved to Chicago to conduct research for my doctoral dissertation in 1995, I was already a somewhat weathered Chicagoan during Congressman Bobby Rush's 1999 mayoral primary run, when the former Black Panther tried to challenge the all-powerful regime of Richard M. Daley, which had spent the previous decade pursuing a global city agenda that had left much of working-class Black and Latino Chicago in a precarious state, by evoking the idea that there were in fact two Chicagos. This is an idea that worked very well for Bill de Blasio recently, but not so well for Bobby Rush. Quote, "One Chicago is symbolized by flower pots and Ferris wheels and good jobs and communities where police respect the citizens," Rush had claimed. "The second Chicago," still quoting Rush, "is still plagued by a lack of jobs, poor schools, and police less tolerant of youths who dress and talk differently than they do," unquote. The result, Daley defeated Rush by a 73-27% margin. And again, Rush was no slouch. As you know, the following year, he would beat Barack Obama in the congressional primary for the 1st District in Illinois. 8 years later, with corruption scandals mounting and Daley pursuing an austerity program that was essentially punishing the poor for the city's exploding debt, it was hard to argue that things hadn't gotten worse, at least for those living in the other Chicago. One of these scandals, we should remember, involved rampant allegations of Black suspects being tortured at the Area 2 police headquarters, and this at a time when the employment rate for Black males over the age of 16 hovered around 50%, putting the city just ahead of St. Louis and well behind Baltimore and Newark. And yet, in the 2007 election, Daley's last, overall voter turnout barely surpassed 30%, with 70% of Blacks and 80% of Latinos casting their votes for Richard M. Daley. And by the way, as you probably know, 30% turnout, if low, was hardly extraordinary for a 21st century big city mayoral election. I chose the phrase power inequality in a modern city as the subtitle to this book because, like many scholars before me, my analysis seeks to show how Chicago was paradigmatic of the broader urban experience in a number of ways, and this was certainly one of them. Indeed, if the city's more than 4 decades of autocratic machine rule under Mayor Richard J. Daley from 55 to 76 and his son Richard M. Daley from 89 to 2011 made it somewhat of an outlier, Chicago's story is nonetheless instructive for those seeking to understand the crisis in urban democracy suggested by sharply declining participation rates in local elections nationwide since the 1980s. Chicago on the Make constitutes an attempt to understand how the injustices I just described could prevail with so little pushback. What explains the incapacity of African Americans, Latinos, and progressive-minded whites in Chicago to mount significant challenges to the political establishment that was maintaining the structural conditions of such dramatic inequalities? What explains something that many historians of the city have taken somewhat for granted? That for over 4 decades of Daley rule, a period that spanned the rise and fall of the modern civil rights movement, the spectacular growth of the middle-class suburbs outside the city limits, the ghettoization of huge swaths of the west and south sides, a massive wave of immigration from Latin America, and the transformation of the city from a motor of industry to a post-industrial node of the global service economy, Chicago scarcely witnessed a legitimate mayoral election or heated city council vote. Most scholars attempting to explain this state of demobilization have focused on the more than 4 decades of autocratic machine rule that shaped the city's political institutions, modes of governance, and political culture. To be sure, the fact that Chicago's vaunted political machine outlasted its analogs in other major cities by decades must enter into any reckoning with politics and power in the Windy City. And Chicago on the Make pays particular attention to this story as well. Where this new story of Chicago diverges from most political histories of the American city in the 20th century is in its effort to view the dynamics of inequality and demobilization as manifestations of a process of neoliberalization, which within Chicago's anti-democratic political machine context advanced somewhat more rapidly and more aggressively than it did elsewhere. Now, I used a nasty word, neoliberalization. Now, I invoke the term neoliberalization because everybody's saying, what does that mean right now? Not merely to connote the implementation of a package of marketizing and privatizing policies that had inadvertent social and political consequences. A more important dimension of the story of neoliberalization I'm seeking to tell involves revealing how market values and economizing logics penetrated into the city's political institutions and beyond them into its political culture. My political history of Chicago seeks to understand from the top down and bottom up how this happened and how the advance of neoliberalization crippled the political forces standing in opposition to it: labor unions, municipal reformers, neighborhood planning groups, civil rights organizations, and a range of other political organizations that sought to challenge injustices within the prevailing social and political order. Neoliberalization, I argue, was propelled forward by racial circumstances, forces, and dynamics. Unlike most scholars working on the neoliberal turn, my analysis places the local politics of race at the center of the story. Economics are the method, Margaret Thatcher once remarked, but the object is to change the soul. In other words, to view neoliberalism too narrowly as simply a policy regime that rose to international prominence beginning in the mid-1970s is to misunderstand how much its triumph rested upon popular support. The free market has triumphed and belief in the state has dissipated because such ideas became embedded within the political cultures of the metropolitan United States. And what my new history of Chicago shows is that racial issues often played crucial roles in changing the souls of many Chicagoans, that the politics of race, in effect, pulled residents into the political sphere and shaped feelings, sensibilities, and ideas that socialized the generation that came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, thereby paving the way for the acceptance of neoliberal forms of governance and values. Now, I don't want to give the impression that my story places Chicago's history on a straight path towards neoliberal domination. There were some big bumps in that road. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed significant challenges to the daily machine in the form of powerful social movements. And yet, if these movements posed real threats to the machine, I think they did, they ended up accelerating the process of neoliberalization in their own ways. On the one hand, working-class white Chicagoans took to the streets against racially integrated public housing projects and the black drive for civil rights between the 1950s and 1970s, a story that historian Arnold Hirsch tells very well, articulating languages of whiteness, anti-statism, and consumer rights, the building blocks of a neoliberal populist culture. On the other hand, minority empowerment movements emerged out of black, Puerto Rican, and Mexican neighborhoods, challenging the daily machine's downtown agenda and demanding political rights and representation. While these minority rights movements did manage to create a tradition of anti-machine activism that stretched across racial and ethnic lines, a situation that bore fruit in the 1983 election of the city's black reformist Mayor Harold Washington, my story about their ultimate fate is unfortunately not a triumphant one. In fact, Chicago on the Make reveals how the politics of racial identity and recognition these movements put into practice came to be powerfully incorporated into the neoliberal project of Richard M. Daley in the 1990s. Unlike his father, Richard J. Daley, for whom, as the joke went, affirmative action was 9 Irishmen and a Swede, Richard M. Daley understood the importance of the politics of recognition for different ethno-racial communities, and he bestowed this recognition in the forms of strategic minority appointments within his administration and official acknowledgement of the physical boundaries and cultural significance of key ethno-racial neighborhoods. Such policies enabled him to create local brokers and middlemen whose ethno-racial legitimacy allowed them to advance the larger neoliberal agenda, especially in the form of pro-gentrification and pro-tourism policies that worked to the disadvantage of renters and public housing residents. Along with the new economy of tourism, the gentrification imperative has driven a range of policies that have ushered in neoliberal sensibilities and forms of governance. It has given private developers an even larger role in the planning process, transformed more and more homeowners into individualistically minded investors, people who think of their properties and their homes as investments, and turned many middle-class Chicagoans against public housing and other state programs that appear to threaten their property values. Neoliberal policies, in other words, the ones that work to unleash the forces of the real estate market in the 1990s, not only boosted property values, which they did in very dramatic fashion, just think of Wicker Park in the 1990s, they also created an experience and process of gentrification that had a strong impact on grassroots politics throughout the gentrification frontier, which encompassed a wide swath of the city. In fact, the story of gentrification is bound up with a number of neoliberal schemes, from tax increment financing to charter schools to a range of privatized city services that signaled the triumph of neoliberalization in Chicago since the late 1980s. And yet the part of my book that I want to read to you tonight describes a moment in Chicago's history when such an outcome was less assured, when the city elected its first black mayor, Harold Washington, on a platform oriented around the objective of shifting power and resources away from downtown business interests towards working-class neighborhoods. And so I'll read you that part now, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about it, because I think it will resonate somewhat in view of recent events in the Trump era. Okay, so the section of the book that I want to read from is called The Black Messiah in Beirut on the Lake. Some very odd things were happening in Chicago in March of 1983. In a city that had not elected a Republican mayor for 56 years, in a city in which Republicans occupied a starring role, along with Jews and blacks, as the butt of barroom jokes in some white working-class precincts, Democrats were volunteering in droves to work in the Republican mayoral campaign. The first sure sign that Chicago had been turned upside down came during the annual St. Patrick's Day Parade, an event that traditionally served as a ritualistic reaffirmation of the bonds of solidarity and loyalty that held the Democratic Party together. Each year, the city colored the Chicago River fluorescent green with gallons of dye, and the machine's leading figures paraded by the party's rank and file wearing green ribbons and leprechaun hats. In election years, as this one was, the parade took on an even greater significance, with the party using the occasion to showcase its ticket. But 1983 was a year that broke with precedent in a number of ways. First, the Democratic Party's mayoral candidate, Harold Washington, who had recently prevailed in a hard-fought primary, did not march at the front of the procession, as was tradition. And when he arrived before the heart of the crowd, one heard not the usual enthusiastic applause, but an intermingling of hushed tones and deflated, seemingly forced cheers. Then, in a truly strange state of affairs, the same crowd greeted the Republican mayoral candidate, Bernard Epton, an anti-machine reformer, a rich guy, a Jew, a resident of Hyde Park, a graduate of the University of Chicago, a composite of all of the qualities that should have rankled the sensibilities of Southside Irish machine loyalists, with a rousing show of support. In one episode later reported in the Chicago Tribune, a woman called out to Epton, and when he turned to look, she opened her coat to reveal a bright green shirt emblazoned with the phrase, "Vote right, vote white." What had upset the natural order in Chicago was the fact that a black man born and raised in Bronzeville, a former member of the Illinois House and Senate who had managed to get himself elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1981, was in all likelihood going to be elected Chicago's next mayor. Normally, the Democratic primary was the mayoral election, with the general election a mere technicality. And Harold Washington began preparing his transition team soon after his startling victory in a three-way race against the incumbent mayor, Jane Byrne, and the future mayor, Richard M. Daley. The Chicago political scene had already been shaken up in 1979 when Byrne had upset Richard J. Daley's successor, Michael Blandick, to become Chicago's first female mayor and the first in any major U.S. city. This was a tremendous feat in an era still touched by the contentious feminist challenges of the 1960s and 1980s. Illinois, it should be pointed out, was one of the 15 states that had refused to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Yet Byrne's gender was never really a major issue. By contrast, faced with the possibility of a black man in the top office at City Hall, white Chicago, with the exception of the lakefront liberal wards around Hyde Park, became gripped by racist hysteria. Addressing a Byrne rally on the Northwest Side days before the primary, Edward Verdoliak, 10th Ward Alderman, chairman of the Democratic Central Committee and close advisor to Jane Byrne, summed it up in one of the more notorious public expressions of unabashed racism outside the Jim Crow South. Quote, "A vote for Daley is a vote for Washington. It's a two-person race. It would be the worst day in the history of Chicago if your candidate was not elected. It's a racial thing. Don't kid yourself. I'm calling on you to save your city, to save your precinct. We're fighting to keep the city the way it is," unquote. Because of Verdoliak's stature, this was big news. But Verdoliak and many Chicagoans seemed puzzled when his remarks became material for political scandal. For weeks, such expressions had been circulating around street corners, taverns, precinct headquarters, and kitchen tables in much of white Chicago, especially on the city's northwest and south sides. And yet, although Verdoliak's remark was indicative of a broader wave of racial hate that would wash over white Chicago in the months to come, it also may have blown the election for Byrne. This might seem like a curious conclusion in view of the fact that this was Chicago, and this was the Reagan era, when Republican politicians north and south made convenient use of popular notions of black cultural dysfunction and ghetto pathology to justify the cries for welfare reform. Moreover, Chicago in particular had a special role to play in the anti-welfare backlash. Perhaps the most conspicuous catchphrase echoing through the attack on the welfare state during the 1980s was "Chicago Welfare Queen," an image Ronald Reagan had conjured up during his 1976 presidential campaign. The Chicago Welfare Queen, according to Reagan's hyperbolic tale, had cheated the federal government out of hundreds of thousands of dollars by having illegitimate children and creating multiple aliases. While Reagan never mentioned explicitly that the woman in his sordid tale was African American, he did specify that she lived on Chicago's south side, a detail whose significance was missed by few. This was typical of the rampant, coded, or ventriloquized cultural racism during these years. By the mid-1980s, universities and corporations alike were instituting cultural sensitivity training programs, and even conservatives who were increasingly appealing to values of colorblindness, meritocracy, and free market individualism, were beginning to understand that racism made them look bad. Furthermore, to confront the demands of minority groups for race-conscious policies, many conservatives had taken to minimizing the presence of racial discrimination. If racism could be eliminated as a cause for poverty, then one could only conclude that some combination of cultural deficiencies, individual failings, and the negative effects of the welfare system itself were to blame for the ghettos and barrios that persisted in American cities. There was thus much to be gained in planting culturally racist notions in the minds of middle-class whites angry about their taxes. But the trick was to do it without opening oneself up to charges of racism. This was why the overt forms of racism that ran wild in Chicago around Harold Washington's rise ended up working to his advantage by shocking outside observers, turning the stomachs of just enough white liberals, and erasing much of Burns' remaining support within the black community. This last effect was perhaps the most critical of all, for it was the astonishing mobilization of the black community that ultimately pushed Washington over the top. Black organizers conducted an aggressive registration campaign that had added over 100,000 black voters, enabling Washington to capture a startling 84.7% of the black vote, which constituted 92.1% of his total citywide. In view of the machine's patronage leverage in black Chicago and the reluctance of many longtime residents to believe in the electability of a black candidate, this was a remarkable feat. In fact, it was common knowledge among political insiders that the machine owned a certain percentage of the black vote, regardless of the candidates vying for election. Famed Chicago campaign manager Don Rose, who had helped Jane Byrne take black votes away from the machine in 1977, estimated the figure to be 20%. Quote, "This is the vote," Rose joked. The machine would deliver for a George Wallace against Martin Luther King. But against Washington, Byrne had garnered the support of a mere 8% of registered black voters. The Washington campaign had accomplished this, according to historian and political consultant William Grimshaw, may he rest in peace, by developing a carnival and movement atmosphere that helped transform its candidate into a messiah. Some of this was orchestrated by Washington's skilled manager and Chicago civil rights veteran Al Raby. But the real magic was in the movement's more spontaneous moments, when street rallies pulled thousands of observers off sidewalks and into swirling, singing, dancing masses, and groups of young people swept through neighborhoods chanting "Harold, Harold, Harold," and knocking on random doors to urge people to vote. It all came together just days before the primary, when more than 12,000 supporters defied a driving snowstorm and packed into UIC's basketball arena for an electrifying 2-hour rally. Days later, after the votes were tallied, Washington had garnered 37% to Burns' 33% and Daley's 30%. But after a raucous victory party, all the carnival jubilation began to ferment into consternation when Washington's supporters began to realize that, unlike in past years, the Democratic machine was not going to marshal its forces for this particular candidate, and the victory in the general election was far from assured. In fact, at first there was a great deal of confusion among the Democratic Party's committeemen. In the immediate aftermath of the primary, Verdoliak told the press that the party would give its full support to the Democratic candidate, and longtime Alderman Vito Marzullo, the boss of Little Italy in the Near West Side since 1953, declared Washington the mayor of Chicago. Then the defections began. Before the end of February, Alderman Aloysius Majorczyk, whose ward encompassed the Polish neighborhoods around the McKinley Park area to the north of the old stockyards, had announced his support for Epton. Referring to the, quote, "message of racial pride," unquote, his constituents had been giving him, Majorczyk told the Tribune, quote, "We're against open housing in my ward, and we always have been," unquote. Indicative of just how much Washington's candidacy was galvanizing whites of all ethnic stripes, Majorczyk's endorsement of Epton was quickly seconded by Ivan Rittenberg, alderman of the traditionally Jewish 40th Ward on the far north side. Days later, the Tribune was reporting that Epton's campaign headquarters in Irish Bridgeport was being overwhelmed by Democratic volunteers, and that in the heavily Italian and Polish neighborhoods of the northwest side, buttons reading "Italians for Eptonini" and Polish for Eptonski were being passed around. Irish, Polish, Jewish, Italian. These were groups that had quarreled almost incessantly over power, place, and resources since before the turn of the century. Certainly, ethnic ties had progressively attenuated in the post-war decades, but it was hard to deny that business relations, real estate dealings, and friendships still tended to work best when the parties involved were of the same ethnic ilk. This was a situation, moreover, that the machine system had promoted with its divide and rule style of governance. It is therefore somewhat ironic that many of the Democrats who defected to the Republican camp justified their decision by claiming that Epton would be somehow better at uniting the city. In fact, whites in the city had never been as unified as they were in the spring of 1983, except perhaps in the months after Chicago's own Jack Johnson became the first black boxer in history to win the heavyweight crown, and the call sounded across the nation for the great white hope who could beat Johnson and thereby restore the supremacy of the white race. Epton was regarded as the next great white hope. Outside of a handful of lakefront liberal and racially mixed wards, the only question for Democratic committeemen was whether to openly oppose Washington or to remain publicly neutral while working behind the scenes against him. However, to say that race was the only issue for many Democratic defectors would be misleading. There is reason to believe that had Washington not run an uncompromising anti-machine campaign, a good many committeemen and aldermen who ended up endorsing Epton would have grudgingly supported him instead. In fact, Washington was something of a machine insider. After earning a law degree at Northwestern University, where he was the only African American in his graduating class, he had worked for 3rd Ward Alderman Ralph Metcalf between 1951 and 1965, a time when Metcalf was still cozy with Daley. Although some hoped that this political experience would make him come around and play ball with the machine, Washington never backed off his promise to rid the city of a system that he claimed perpetuated outdated politics and pie-in-the-sky financing while providing fat consultant contracts for a few politically connected firms and jobs for a few patronage workers, unquote. He was therefore a threat to the aldermen and committeemen, whose power rested in their ability to lubricate their precincts with patronage. If, as Milton Rakoff had observed, the men who had dominated the Chicago machine were above all else practical, pragmatic, parochial, and non-ideological, then the color of Washington's skin should have made little difference. But it did, alas, it did. Why it did, however, had to do more with culture than ideology, and it had less to do with machine cadres than with ordinary Chicagoans infusing the normally staid conduct of mayoral politics with a new energy, anger, and urgency. When Rakoff wrote his scathing indictment of the machine in the early 1970s, the system he was attacking was still working to keep the city's political culture impervious to the ideological challenges of the era: liberalism, democracy, conservatism, you name it. Its ability to do this with such efficacy had allowed it to outlast all the other big city machines by decades. But what Rakoff could not see as he was completing his manuscript was the role that grassroots cultural struggles would play in the coming years. By the early 1980s, the national political landscape was increasingly characterized by seemingly irreconcilable conflicts over cultural issues and moral values. Abortion rights, censorship of obscenity, and gay rights constituted the first wave of culture wars to grip the country. But beginning in the early 1970s, a new set of cultural issues revolving around the lingering questions of racial segregation and inequality had moved into the political sphere, as white Americans debated policies like busing and affirmative action, and responded to minority claims for greater cultural respect and recognition in institutions of higher learning. Such issues did not seem to translate into what one might call politics in Chicago. Aldermen like Vito Marzullo and Roman Puczynski, the leader of Chicago Polonia since 1959, knew little, if anything, about the politics of recognition and political correctness. Politics to them was filling potholes, fixing parking tickets, and doling out jobs and contracts to key constituents. However, whether they knew it or not, the cultural politics of race was overtaking them, even if it would not remove them from power. One of the first things they learned was that they would have to watch what they said much more than before. One of the signs that Chicago was merging to a greater extent with mainstream political culture were the many allegations of racism that were flying around the city's newspapers. While many of these charges were, of course, warranted, some white Chicagoans began complaining that black leaders were construing as racist any opposition to Washington. In the face of such allegations, the Epton campaign and its supporters began throwing around charges of reverse racism, claiming that the blacks accusing them of racism were in fact the racists, not them. These were sentiments that would be increasingly heard on college campuses in the coming years, as minority groups pressed their demands for greater cultural recognition and conservatives decried the censorship and factionalism of political correctness. But such circumstances had seldom been witnessed in big city politics. In retrospect, it now seems clear that Chicago was in 1983 staging one of the first major dramas of the new era of culturalized politics, when all that separated whites from blacks, space, wealth, ideology, would be reduced to ethnocultural factors. By the 1980s, a politics of resentment was clearly taking hold on both sides of the color line across the United States. Blacks were resentful about all of the unfulfilled promises of the civil rights era, and whites about what they perceived as the stubborn refusal of blacks to let the race issue drop after the civil rights victories of the 1960s. But white resentment in particular went beyond this. White resentment, as Chicago 83 demonstrated, was not only articulated in cultural terms, it was about culture itself. As whites in Chicago gazed at the expressions of cultural pride and solidarity on display in Washington's messianic movement, they understood on a palpable level that blacks possessed something they lacked. As one Epton supporter so poignantly lamented about the dilemma of opposing Washington, we're racist and he has cultural pride. Such expressions of cultural envy and resentment explain a great deal about the violence that was entering Chicago's mayoral election around this time. Even if most operatives within the machine still tended to view the stakes of the election in terms of controlling political power and patronage, the groundswell of opposition to Washington was taking the whole affair into an entirely new realm. What was behind the bitter racial hatred exploding into public life in Chicago resembled, on some level, Slavoj Žižek's description of the dynamics underlying the ethno-racial tensions that tore the Balkans apart in the late 1980s and 1990s. Critical to Žižek's perspective is the idea that what drove the nationalist fears of ethno-racial others were imagined thefts of enjoyment, the idea that racial others threatened to take away from the dominant group's way of life. This seems an apt way to explain what was transpiring as more and more Chicagoans were articulating the feeling that defeating Washington in the election was a matter of saving their neighborhoods and their city, a sentiment Epton sought to capitalize on by choosing the incendiary campaign slogan, Epton before it's too late. Epton, of course, denied the phrase had any racial implications, insisting it related to the city's impending fiscal crisis, but this was disingenuous. Epton understood very well that in the eyes of many white Chicagoans, a victory by Washington meant the loss of their city as they knew it. Not only did they fear that blacks would finally get their rightful share of the patronage pie, but for many whites, a city run by blacks would be a city of immorality, corruption, and danger, where public culture would become synonymous with some nightmarish vision of the black nationalist ghetto. Under such conditions, racism ran wild throughout the city in the most virulent forms, seemingly unrestrained by any codes of propriety or civility. The first sign that things were getting out of control occurred on Palm Sunday, March 27th. Washington and former Vice President Walter Mondale had planned to attend religious services at St. Paschal's Catholic Church on the Northwest Side. But when they arrived, they discovered "Nigger Die" painted on a church door. Later, upon leaving the church, the two were mobbed by hundreds of frenzied Epton supporters, screaming racial epithets and other insults. Around this time, a number of racially vicious flyers began circulating in many white neighborhoods. One suggested facetiously that if Washington won, the name of the city would be changed to Chicago, and that the city's official police insignia would include images of a watermelon slice and a rack of ribs. Another joked that Washington would place basketball hoops on the Chicago Picasso and rename the CTA Soul Train. While Epton, of course, stayed clear of such low tactics, he nonetheless engaged in a smear campaign loaded with thinly veiled cultural racism, all the while accusing blacks in the local media of playing the race card. Understanding the propensity of whites to buy into welfare queen notions of black corruption and criminality, Epton exploited some minor legal problems in Washington's past to impugn his integrity. Washington, it was true, had been in legal trouble in 1972 for failing to file income tax returns. And in 1970, he had his law license suspended for billing a client for services he did not perform. But the amounts of money in question in both instances were insignificant. In a city like Chicago, where corruption was more the rule than the exception, such attacks against a white candidate would have been laughable. Of course, Epton never said anything racist per se, but he knew where his comments would lead. By the time Chicagoans cast their votes, Washington had been forced to publicly defend himself against the baseless charge that he'd been convicted for child molestation. However, once again, on the eve of the election, as in the primary, the expression of such ugly racism actually worked in Washington's favor. In what was the closest mayoral election in Chicago since 1919, Washington managed to prevail by just 46,250 votes out of a total of 1.29 million. The event was one of not just national, but international importance. Black mayors had headed major American cities since 1973, when Tom Bradley was elected in Los Angeles, Coleman Young in Detroit, and Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. But this was Chicago, the city with the second largest black population in the United States, where the saga of black struggle was particularly well known. Moreover, it was an event of great significance for the black diaspora, of lesser magnitude, of course, but not unlike the election of Barack Obama as president in 2008. Indeed, Washington's election was made possible by a breathtaking show of black solidarity, and as such, was a source of inspiration for blacks all over the world. As in the primary, African Americans had turned out in record numbers and voted almost unanimously for Washington, while his opponent had captured an overwhelming share, 87.6% of the white vote. I'll stop there. Thank you all for coming.